So welcome everyone to already the fourth event of the Ayse's Decolonizing series after the summer break. My name is Tasneem Anwar, and together with my colleague Beste Işleyen, we organized this series discussing various topics from a decolonial, post-colonial perspective. Last time we discussed the topic of climate change and Anthropocene with our esteemed guest, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. Also, the video of the conversation can now be found online on the Ayse's YouTube channel. And today I'm very happy to be speaking with two distinguished scholars on the topic of sovereignty and Europe. So we have touched upon the issue of sovereignty and modernity before during several sessions. And today is really focused on exploring this topic further and speaking about political authority and also interventions. Also as part of the key debates in post-colonial and decolonial theory. So our speakers discuss why and how the study of sovereignty has largely been Eurocentric in mainstream international relations literature, and we'll also focus on non-European subjects and events in the history of colonialism. And through this, we try to offer alternative ways and to overcome the current limitations of the mainstream IR debates on modern statehood and territoriality. So it's my honor to introduce the speakers of today, Dr. Ayşe Zarakol, who is a reader in international relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. And her primary research interests are focused on international security. She works on the evolution of East and West relations in the international order, declining and rising powers, and politics of non-Western regional powers. And she's also, among many other things, currently an associate editor at the Journal of Global Security Studies. No?
That's done. That has been old while. Sorry.
Update. And our second esteemed guest is Dr. Javier Mathieu, who's a lecturer in politics at the University of Liverpool. And his research interest includes sovereignty, international intervention, responsibility to presentation, Eurocentrism, and identity in international encounters, and also has published widely on these topics. So welcome both. I'm very happy and honored that you could be here with us today. I think especially today, considering everything that's going on in the world right now. So I'm very happy that you could be here and to share your expertise and your work on these topics. So I just immediately want to kick off maybe with also a slightly more personal question, and that would be that, you know, I'm really interested in knowing what motivated you personally in your research on the concept of sovereignty. So whether you can explain briefly what your point of departure is, how you got interested in the topic. Ayşe, can I invite you?
Sure. So the way I came to study sovereignty, I suppose, is somewhat indirect. I mean, I didn't set out saying to myself, I will now theorize sovereignty. But starting from more substantive research questions having to do with East-West relations and stigmatization and so on, which my first book is about, and growing increasingly dissatisfied with the way we theorize in international relations. I've been driven to find or improve concepts so that they are not Eurocentric and are not particularly caught in one time period or attached to a particular space. I just think, you know, we would theorize better if if our concepts, the building blocks of our theories, didn't suffer from these types of flaws. So I've been working on essentially, yeah, getting better concepts, and sovereignty is one of those. So yeah, in order to get to where I was going, I had to develop a better understanding of sovereignty for myself. That was not Eurocentric, so that's my interest in sovereignty. Yeah.
And Javier, what is your starting point of studying?
Yeah, I guess sort of in a sort of similar way as well. So I started by being interested in why it's still so difficult to conceptualize and understand this concept in IR, and that's kind of strange situation where it's so central to the discipline itself, to how the discipline defines itself, and to the practice of international relations as well, and why it's so difficult to know what it means, really what it is. And so some people would say, well, that's just very simple. It's because, you know, powerful actors do what they want, and so they just like this ambiguity and they play with it. But I think there's another element to it that is much more important that we're obviously going to talk about today, which is that a lot of the elements that we need to understand sovereignty have been taken out of it. They've been removed from view in a way. So when we talk about you know, racism, colonialism, civilization, etc., all of that is just taken as if it was outside of the concept and having no influence on it. And so that's when I realized that actually I wasn't so much interested in the sort of very technical, almost dry kind of idea of sovereignty, but I was more interested in the way sovereignty interacts with this idea of how do we organize differences at the international level? How do we think about difference and the relationship between different societies as well? How do we create, you know, this sense of hierarchy at the international level as well? And for all of those questions that are very political and very central as well, sovereignty is always there. It's always kind of in the middle. And it's, so I think that, you know, looking at sovereignty is a very sort of, it could appear as a very dry topic in a lot of ways, but it's actually very political when we start reintroducing those elements that have been taken out, you know, of the concepts, such as, you know, diversity, equality, difference, etc. When we try to reintegrate those elements, then it becomes a fascinating kind of idea to try and reconceptualize or think about.
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's really interesting to see how indeed much of your interest and your curiosity, and maybe if I can paraphrase, even also a little bit of frustration with traditional concepts or understandings of sovereignty, that it also comes from an empirical kind of that the empirics or the history show something different than the theory around sovereignty implies. And I think that you also show that in your research, where, for example, Ayşe, you point to the Eurocentric accounts of sovereignty by studying the absence of non-Europeans in analysis. And Javier, you also argue in your research to go beyond the domestic to study constructions of sovereignty. So I would like to maybe invite you both to give some specific empirical and historical examples that complicate the Eurocentric approaches to sovereignty that you just described. Ayşe, can I give the floor back to you?
Sure. I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle these days, because I'm about to finish a book which is reconstructing international relations history in Eurasia, starting in 13th century. And my real goal is to re-theorize the concept of decline in world politics. And I just thought we need additional historical cases. So I've been focusing, I mean, that is to say, in the work that I've been doing in service of that book in the last 5-6 years or so, I've been looking at the pre-19th century period. And that came out of my initial work, which was looking at 19th century onwards, the evolution of the modern order, incorporation of, you know, non-Western regions into that order, and I increasingly became, I mean, puzzled by 19th century as a turning point, which it is. I would, you know, most of us think so, and I would agree. But I thought in order to understand the 19th century, I needed to learn more about what was happening before the 19th century. And the work I've done in service of that has essentially made me question accounts of the emergence of sovereignty and state development that we have, whether in the mainstream, you know, this idea of, you know, the Westphalian state formation, and then it is it is exported elsewhere, or the more critical accounts, which is that, again, there is this state formation and that it's forced upon others through colonialism. I mean, not that those accounts are completely wrong. I mean, I do sympathize with a lot of it, but I think what was missing from the picture is what was happening elsewhere in the world when stuff was happening in Europe. So if we start bringing in, what's happening in Eurasia in the 15th century, 16th century, in terms of political centralization, emergence of sovereignty, and so on, a lot of assumptions that we have about various processes being unique to Europe are really challenged. There are parallels or precursors elsewhere. So I think that's what my work brings. It's not necessarily to challenge insights from post-colonial literature and the damage done in the 19th century, but it's to add or fill out the picture. And I think I'm increasingly concerned that as right as the critiques of the post-colonial literature has been, we've developed a tendency in IR in incorporating those insights in like lumping all regions together as if they had the same experience. And I think we need to start distinguishing a bit between the histories of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and there are shared experiences, especially after the 19th century, but there are also differences that are worth exploring, and maybe we should be a bit skeptical of present-day Asian states, especially latching onto that discourse. I've written about this with Gülşah Çapan. Anyway, we can talk about that more, but I think we need more nuance in our understanding of what came before the colonial experience or the European colonial experience.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an important intervention, and also to emphasize that also the experience of these different regions, non-European regions, should not be just lumped together as if it's like a homogeneous experience. So I think it's a really important addition to the debate. Javier, can I invite you also to reflect on that and also give from your research some empirical examples how to approach this?
Yeah, I think so. In a sort of similar way, I got interested in the emergence of the state, and what you find out. I mean, it's so striking, really, when you think about it. In Western European states, proto-states, if you want, in the 16th century, for instance, you get the emergence, centralization of the state, really, the state sort of authority being more and more accepted and being legitimized. And at the same time, you get that huge sort of wave of colonization, modern colonization, with the discovery of America, etc. So those two things happening at the same time in a similar period with similar actors as well, and yet they're usually disconnected or presented as unrelated processes, which is really quite striking and counterintuitive. So what I was focusing on in my research was trying to see whether there was any connection between them and how they would connect, especially when we talk about sovereignty and claiming sovereignty. And so trying to sort of reintegrate those situations that have been excluded from the analysis of sovereignty and its emergence, essentially. So trying to think about what is seen as kind of abnormal almost when we think about the history of sovereignty. So abnormal international situations such as situations of inequality, domination, imperialism, racism, colonialism, all of that. When you read the sort of mainstream literature on sovereignty in IR, are seen as exceptions or as historical chapters that are in the past and that were exceptions and problems, really, that they don't have any influence on sovereignty itself. Sovereignty sort of goes through that almost untouched, as a pure kind of construct almost. And so I wanted to try and reintegrate that history that has been erased a little bit and so to give you some examples, so what I've been looking at, for instance, so I've been looking at the case of France in particular in the 16th century. I've been looking a lot at political theorists, scholars writing about political authority and sovereignty at that period. And what you quickly realize is that there is no sovereignty without a very strong normative discourse that is influenced by evolutionary thinking. So the idea of the state of nature, for instance, the idea of the savages, the idea of civilization, the idea of races being inferior to others, all of those are absolutely central in the way they understood political authority, and they understood sovereignty as well. So clearly those ideas of progress, you know, out of savagery into civilization are absolutely essential in the way sovereignty was being conceptualized. And then even in the practice of it, what I was interested in is sort of looking at how processes domestically and internationally were linked to one another, whether there was any influence of one on the other, etc. And you see that the two processes are very similar. So political actors, kings, you know, in France were claiming sovereignty domestically by portraying adversaries as savages, at the same time as they were claiming sovereignty over the Amerindians by claiming that they were savages as well. So the two processes are similar in a way, and they inform one another, because you can find sort of mirrors between them and references to one another as well. So the more you can claim sovereignty domestically, the more you will be able to claim it internationally, and you will use this international claim to reinforce your own domestic standing against your internal or domestic sort of, you know, enemies, if you want. So yeah, so that's kind of how I've tried to reintegrate those two processes and reveal how the history of sovereignty in Western Europe and the history of colonialism are very much interlinked, and they sort of work together, and there's an interplay between the two very much. So that's kind of a point that I mean, a lot of people have been trying to make that point. I've made that point much better than I have really. But I think it's just interesting to think about that, because you know, I mean, we shouldn't be excluding those histories, those kind of moments in international history from our understanding of sovereignty itself, because they are, you know, essential moments in which sovereignty was being formed and constructed. So they're not exceptions. They're not things that we can just forget. They really reveal how sovereignty has been built on a discourse that is racist, civilizational, excluding others, etc. So
yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And it's so, I mean, it's so interesting, because you also refer to this idea of progress, you know, from non-civilized to civilized societies. And previously on these series, we also talked about this kind of linear understanding of time and progress, you know, as somehow, and this is true, that erasure of the different discourses, that it can, you know, that colonizing states can portray this kind of linear route, so to say, from non-civilized states into civilized states. And of course, they are there to kind of guide that process. So I think that's a very interesting contribution. And also both of your reflections now, it resonates a lot with also things that my students recently have said when we talk about specifically post-colonial state formations in the Middle East, that although they learn about it, they never really made the connection that this is actually, you know, also part of sovereignty. So like you said, Javier, they really saw it as something that's, you know, kind of somehow excluded from that discourse. So thank you both so much for this. And just to build up on that, so sovereignty and also the idea of, you know, this international community of equal sovereigns is based on something that many scholars have already deconstructed, but it's the myth of this kind of equality, and that all sovereign states are somehow equal, and that they uphold this principle of non-intervention. So states do not meddle in other states' internal affairs. But we also know from critical scholarship in both international law as well as international relations that if we look at the historical examples, that this actually interventions have always been part and parcel of the building of sovereign states. So can you maybe reflect from your research, but also into contemporary practices around politics of military interventions? I know, Javier, for example, you have focused also on the responsibility to protect, also these kind of doctrines that, you know, form our understanding of military interventions and sovereignty. Ayşe, can I give the floor back to you?
Sure, but I think Javier probably has much more to say about this. I mean, I don't work on intervention per se. So I don't know that. I mean, I can say something really novel about this. I would say, I mean, interventions of one form or another. It's not just our order or the colonial order before that. They're just almost trans-historical kind of dynamic. I mean, it always happens. I think to the extent that we are bothered by them, you know, that itself is a product of the particular, you know, normative order that we find ourselves in. I mean, the fact that they become politicized in this way. I mean, I'm not saying interventions are good, but it's one of the things that we are especially bothered by because we find ourselves in this sovereign state model. So the thing that produces it is also produces its critique. Again, it's not that particularly interesting what I'm saying, but sometimes I think it gets overlooked. Javier, so I'll yield the floor to you on this question.
I'm not sure I have anything incredibly novel to say about this, but I think what I find particularly interesting. So you were mentioning R2P, for instance, the responsibility to protect. I mean, it's interesting in a way because sometimes it's portrayed as something completely new and groundbreaking and a change and a revolution in the way we understand sovereignty, etc. But really, to argue this, you have to create that sort of image of sovereignty again as a concept without substance, as a concept that is sort of so neutral and pure that it's never been defined according to normative principles. And that's not really the case when you look at the history of sovereignty itself. So R2P is just sort of the last embodiment of this. And so it's problematic to argue that this is a big change in the way international relations function. The main change is that this is probably sort of codified in such a way that was not the case before, maybe. But otherwise, the situation remains pretty much the same. So you're talking about intervention. So I think what I found interesting with sovereignty and the idea of intervention and non-intervention in particular is that sovereignty is sort of facilitating interventionary practices in a lot of ways, even though it's obviously always associated with this idea of non-intervention. But if you can dress your intervention in the language of sovereignty, with the concept of sovereignty, then you make it much more legitimate, and it's much easier to justify specific forms of intervention. So sovereignty has a strong sort of legitimizing power there, because it serves to hide other aspects such as racism, civilization, imperial conceptions, etc. So it serves to sort of as a to hide those kind of elements, and it does that very, very effectively, really. So if you think about I mean, there's a lot of different analysis about those big military interventions, but if you think about just small sort of everyday interventions, they're equally influenced by those kind of practices. I'm always amazed. So I'm French, and I'm always amazed by the way French politicians sort of intervene, express their opinions about the conduct of politics, legislation, elections, etc. in ex-former colonies of France. And this is something that is seen as completely normal and legitimate in France itself and in a lot of the media as well. When in fact, because it is sort of referred to as, always is sort of explained in the language of sovereignty. So those states not being, properly fully sovereign, so we can, intervene in that way in their own kind of politics, etc. So it feels that the language of sovereignty is allowing us to continue those practices where former colonies are always on the path of becoming sovereign, and we wonder whether they will ever become really fully sovereign, really at this rate. So sovereignty is really sort of a tool in a lot of ways for states to kind of claim a right to intervene and a right to intervention when they see fit. And it's so useful and so strong and so sort of powerful because it hides certain elements, civilizational kind of judgments and discourses, racism, etc. that are at the basis of those practices of intervention, really.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it's really interesting also how you started with saying that the R2P doctrine is somehow presented as revolutionary or something new, whereas I think that the emphasis on states protecting their own civilians and especially the judgment of failing, putting that label on state really is a continuation of this kind of idea of civilizing or disciplining states into what's supposed to be the European model of being a good sovereign state. So I think it's really fascinating. And so my follow-up question would be more about the question of how to study this. So both of you have tried to give a different perspective and different historical examples to the idea of sovereignty and especially the traditional way of studying this in IR. So I was wondering, along a more epistemic question, did you change or how did you change your methods to provide these non-Eurocentric analysis of the history of sovereignty? Or do you have any suggestions for if one would like to start this kind of endeavor, how do you start? Where do you start? Which kind of epistemic choices did you make in engaging in this particular research? Ayşe, can I invite you first?
Yes. Thank you. It's an excellent question. It's something that I think about a lot, and it's actually very difficult to avoid Eurocentrism. There are a lot of traps, so you have to be very reflexive about it in a manner. I mean, just going the distance isn't enough. Just leaving Europe and writing about other regions isn't enough, because that comes with its own potential, pitfalls. So, for instance, if you travel the distance, but you're still talking about it from perspective of Europe or European actors, I think there is still, I mean, that work is worthwhile. It needs to be done. For instance, what Javier is doing, looking at the effect of that back in Europe, for instance, I think it's very worthwhile, and but it needs to be complemented. I think we're writing histories of particular regions that don't involve Europe or European actors, which is what I'm trying to do in this book that I'm finishing. I try to write about the international relations of Asia, if not assuming European primacy, because European actors don't actually become important to Asian politics until probably the end of 18th century, really. I mean, in a significant way. So for somebody who's sitting in 15th century, they are very peripheral actors. So why would we write the history from the perspective of peripheral actors, or only from the perspective of peripheral actors? Another temptation is to read the ending of the story into historical dynamics. And that is a problem that permeates a lot of work, because we know something happened in Europe in 19th century, or the rise of the West or whatever. We see everything through that filter, and we assume, and then things take on significance or overlooked because we know the ending. And again, I think you have to kind of place yourself in the shoes of an actor present at that time. How would they understand what was happening, which is not necessarily the ending that we know. And of course, having to think about concepts, what I opened with, sovereignty is one, but trying to find concepts that don't come with particular Eurocentric assumptions or baggage. It's very difficult because concepts have their own histories. Some are better than others. So I'm always searching for, centralization or hierarchy. I think some are easier to use for this type of cross-cultural, cross-temporal theorization. So those are some beginning points, but it's just layer upon layer, and you just always have to be kind of checking yourself and accepting that you will inevitably reproduce some of the blind spots and biases, and hopefully somebody else will come and correct your work. So I see it as kind of a gradual process.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if we have time left, I would love to hear also more about the concepts and the way you have use them also to analyze the East-West relations. So hopefully we can come back to that. But first, I would like to invite Javier also to reflect on the question of epistemic choices.
This is a very, I mean, I agree, it's a very good question, but also a very difficult one. And I also agree what has just been said, you know, constantly checking, you know, on yourself, being reflexive about your own position and how you start analyzing something, such as sovereignty, in order yeah. I guess, I mean, so when we talk about, so you talk about decolonizing, you know, sovereignty here. And there's obviously the question about agency is really important here. And so one of the key questions is to try and see how we recover or how we unsilence, you know, the agency of the non-West, the non-European, because that agency was very much sort of hidden and silenced through sovereignty and through, you know, the kind of misrecognitions, misrepresentations, etc., that sovereignty has generated, really. So how do we, so I think interrogating how those exclusions were created and trying to unsilence, you know, those others is probably a good thing to do. But there's also a much bigger question. I mean, it's just opening, this question is just opening so many other questions in a way, but because there's a bigger question, it's very complex as well, but how can we, or can we actually think beyond or without sovereignty altogether? Because, so as you said just earlier, you know, sovereignty is, it comes with a bit of a big baggage, you know, as a worldview almost. It's imposing things on us. And we are, you know, as someone said, you know, we are captives of sovereignty in a lot of ways. So we can't think about independence or, you know, self-determination or freedom or equality outside of that language of sovereignty, which is a big problem, because sovereignty is a very specific form of exercising, you know, power, of legitimizing power, that we might think is sort of normal, but I think it's just been imposed for such a long time on Western societies that in Western societies it feels like a normal way of exercising power, but it might not be the case for everyone. And so how do we try and recover different forms of thinking about, you know, political authority, which in itself is just creating even more questions, really, because you start, you know, there's a risk, obviously, that you start looking for, you know, alternatives elsewhere, and you start romanticizing, you know, this other, this elsewhere, as someone who can offer almost an alternative, you know, can offer a solution to our problems in a way. So there are a lot of risks in doing that as well, and starting down that path of trying to look for alternatives elsewhere to sovereignty, to sovereign power, because there's a risk of, again, using the other as a tool almost to solve issues for us. So as a sort of, and again, by doing that, silencing that other in a different way, right? So not in the same original way, but, you know, extracting knowledge, you know, from this other. And there's also an even more complex element, which I'm still kind of, you know, trying to think about, and I don't have a good answer to that, but what if non-Western agencies expressed using the terms of sovereignty is expressed through sovereignty as well? And the decolonial period is obviously a good example of that, when, you know, independence movements were claiming sovereignty in order to regain some agency at least. And so there's, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Joan Cox. She wrote about sovereignty as a delusion, and she said that sovereignty is self-multiplying and self-naturalizing, because even those who are oppressed by it want to claim it as well, and they you know, they have the desire for it, even though they're being oppressed by it. So, you know, what does that mean for, you know, for us when we try to look for something else? It's you know, it's very difficult. Should we regard those claims to sovereignty as not being authentic enough in a way? You know, that's just, you know, and is it fair to ask the non-West or others to come up with a different model, with a different form of exercising authority, with a different form of legitimizing political authority, when the norm of sovereignty is so entrenched and is seen as a kind of an easier way to gain or regain that agency and that independence and that voice? So it's yeah, is it fair to ask that of, you know, non-Western actors, for instance? But at the same time, it's kind of a difficult situation. It's almost a kind of a, you know, catch-22 situation where you can achieve some sort of recognition and agency through sovereignty, but then you lose part of your identity, or you can try and claim something else, regain your values and your identity, but you will not be recognized and you'll be denied full agency in the international society. You know, so it's just it's a very difficult question. It's a very interesting question. It's very difficult to kind of guide, you know, research, or to say this is the type of research that we need, because there's so many unknowns here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that extensive reflection. And I think it also relates to what Ayşe said in the beginning, that there is this kind of inherent danger also in then homogenizing the experience of the other, right? So you kind of fall into the trap that you're actually trying to avoid. So I think that's a very interesting and important remark that, you know, is really part also of this, of why we want to ask this question, because I think it's really important also to have that awareness of not reproducing exactly the same kind of silencing and exclusionary forms of knowledge and practices that Eurocentric approaches to sovereignty have produced. So thank you so much both for answering these questions. We have some questions from the audience that I would like to read to you. So we have a question from one of our colleagues, Louisa, who says, thank you for a great discussion. It was interesting to hear your reflection on the interaction between state making at home in the colonial metropoles and abroad. I think we are more familiar with how that was happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but not the 1600s. So thanks for bringing that to our attention. The question is, you gave some examples of how intervention today is justified in states presented as failed states or otherwise unable to properly exercise their sovereignty. This sort of paternalistic sovereignty is visible in ongoing forms of sovereignty teaching and making. Here I'm thinking of how EU agencies and states teach proper border management. Could you perhaps comment on the longer historical legacies here? Javier, can I pass this question to you? So it was quite long, maybe to sum it up, it's really about this paternalistic idea of sovereignty and also how it's thought through, for example, border management practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can sort of go back to my original point about sovereignty being constructed on a sort of a normative element, a sort of normative expectation of what a society is supposed to be, what a state is supposed to be, and how it's supposed to behave itself, in order to bring this idea of, you know, the good life or something, you know, a sort of progression towards something good, essentially. And so that's the way sovereignty sort of works as a concept. It's always built and always referring to those normative elements about what a state should be. And so in those examples here in the question, like some examples are obviously quite you know, extreme, like failed states, for instance, are clearly states that are not fulfilling, you know, their sort of sovereign kind of duties, if you want. So clearly interventions there are seen as perfectly justified. But there's a whole set of other mechanisms through which, you know, states and societies are being disciplined and sort of intervened in that are less intrusive and less extreme than that example. And so the idea of how states are being socialized, you know, into being normal states and good states, in particular, how to properly manage your border, for instance. Again, this is kind of, I mean, I don't know about the longer historical legacies here, but clearly you could see that when states were deemed not to be fit enough to be independent, you know, for instance, so they needed that kind of paternalistic help from Western states to further develop and to become fully sovereign, really. So you see that in the history of, you know, the colonization, decolonization as well. You see those kind of paternalistic forms of management of other states by Western actors.
Thank you so much for that question. I have many interesting questions, but I wanted to follow up with a question I think more directed at Ayşe's work, which is posed by Hannah Mühlenhoff, who says, thank you for the important discussion. I'm thinking of the work of Cynthia Weber on sovereignty. could you reflect on what we can learn from your work on different histories of sovereignty for how gender and sexuality have interacted with race, colonialism, and imperialism in the production of meaning around sovereignty over time? Also, maybe a more immense.
So, sorry, I lost you. Oh no. I guess I can look at the question from, do we get to see the questions also?
Yeah, if you click on Q&A, yeah, you will see it's the last question.
Okay. So I mean, I suppose this is the question. The question is asking if I can self-moderate. I will read the question. It's asking me, and I think Javier, to reflect on the work on Cynthia Weber on sovereignty. What can we learn from our works on different histories of sovereignty for how gender and sexuality have interacted with race, colonialism, and imperialism in the production of meaning around sovereignty over time, and maybe more emancipatory claims to sovereignty. So this, again, this is not something that I work on directly, especially because recently I have not been working on recent international history. I've gotten lost in earlier periods. As a general thing, I would say, you know, the way we produce meaning is always related, and international orders, or what you may call world orders, you know, if we get away from 19th century stuff, they're always, you know, disseminating various norms around sovereignty, but also this other stuff. And those norms are interacting with, you know, local variations that they interact, and, you know, producing new meanings or contested meanings. So any history of sovereignty can well engage in these other issues, and probably should, although it, I suppose, depends on what your emphasis is. Javier, do you have anything to say about?
Yeah, I think I can sort of talk to the question a little bit in terms of, I mean, you ask how gender, sexuality, race sort of interact in the formation of sovereignty, and I think if you go back to, in my own research, where I see that interaction working really is in the concept of savagery, because the savage is someone who is different racially, but also someone who is sort of attributed a sort of more feminine character or characteristics, and having a sort of a sexuality that is abnormal as well. And so if you look at the sort of construction of sovereignty, you know, in the 16th century, those kind of texts that are actually really fun to read in a lot of ways, you can see those ideas of savagery there, and how the idea of sexuality are being used to construct the savage, and this image of the savage, and by opposition the civilized and the sovereign, really. And the very sovereign, you know, the pure sovereign, the king, is essentially a father as well. So so again, you go back to those ideas of gender here in the construction of sovereignty, and again in the actual colonial encounter as well. You could see how savagery and the emphasis on, you know, sexuality and, you know, having sort of marriage, for instance, you know, marriage laws that are not very established among the savages, among the Amerindians. You could see how that was used by the French in my own case study to claim that those populations were savage, and therefore they could not possess, you know, sovereignty. So clearly, gender, sexuality are always sort of interlinked with race and in those constructions of sovereignty as well.
Of course, I mean, one thing to be careful about is race and gender, especially, and to maybe some extent sex. I mean, they're both categories of analysis that we use historically, but they're also historically produced categories. So somebody in the time period that we're discussing would not necessarily relate to the world with those categories. So there is an additional layer of, you know, something else that you need to be mindful of when you take those categories and use them for historical analysis.
Yeah, thank you for these answers. As you might have maybe realized that there has been a technical failure. Both Tasnim and I were outside the Zoom, and I see that Tasnim cannot come back, so I'm going to take over as the chair. So I have also some remaining questions in the chat box, and I had a question myself, but I couldn't use the Q&A, so maybe this is an opportunity for me to combine two questions. So Polly Pallister-Wilkins asks, what opportunity do indigenous approaches to sovereignty offer to unsettle the sovereignty-territorial relationship? And I also had a question, because when we look at post-colonial struggles, for example, having a sovereign state was also part of the resistance, right? The countries also try to show that they are able to govern themselves. So maybe combining these questions, can you tell us a little bit more on the role of sovereignty in resistance movements in different parts of the world?
Should I go first, or would you like to?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing, answering both of those questions, now we use sovereignty to mean nation-state sovereignty. So we're using the term as kind of a shorthand. And I suppose one thing to be careful about is sovereignty has been conceived in many different ways historically, and often those conceptions of sovereignty have not included territoriality. So to the extent that those alternative conceptions of sovereignty have survived the age of nationalism and nation states pushing international ordering, yes, they can be a form of resistance, or at least they could be deployed to justify particular sorts of resistances. So indigenous forms, I mean, religious appeals, any kind of alternative conception can be used in this manner, is what I would say. Yeah, Javier?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the answer to those kind of questions depends on how you see sovereignty as a concept, and whether you see sovereignty as being able to accommodate different forms of maybe political authority, different forms of exercising, power, different conceptions of the world as well, etc. So whether you see the concept itself as being tied to a particular model that is a Western model that has changed through time as well, it hasn't stayed the same, but you see it as tied to Western history and Western values, and as being sort of forever linked to those, essentially, or whether you see it as being open and able to accommodate others and other worldviews in particular. My answer to that would be that it is open to accommodating other worldviews potentially, but it has not necessarily been used in that way. When you think about decolonial movements, they were much more worried about reproducing a particular forms of sovereignty, because that was the dominating form of sovereignty, and they need to be accepted in a way or recognized. But potentially you could think that sovereignty could serve as a vehicle for accommodating difference and other forms of thinking about political authority. But there is a disagreement on that. I mean, some people say that it has to be tied to a specific restrictive kind of understanding, and therefore we have to look beyond sovereignty if we want to think about alternatives. We have to look for different forms of authority if we want to kind of have some form of alternative here. And others think that the concept is much more kind of changeable and adaptable to different situations, different demands. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's difficult questions.
Hi, sorry. the whole UFA network kicked me out of everything, so apologies for that. Thank you, Beste, for stepping in on my behalf. Did you cover the questions in the Q&A already?
Yeah, there is only one question I didn't cover, and this is from Nadia, I guess.
Okay, would you mind reading it, because my Q&A box is empty, I think because I entered late. So we can do it as a final question, if that's okay.
Yeah, as a final question from Nadia Corniotti. Thank you for your presentations. I have been wondering whether Javier can expand a bit on the issue that former colonies are always on the path of being sovereign. I am an international lawyer, so the IR perspective on this would be very enlightening. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess my perspective on this is that sovereignty is always used as a standard that keeps sort of moving, as a goalpost almost, that keeps moving in a way. And so the only it's always an ideal in a lot of ways, and it's you know, the ideal of sovereignty is not necessarily realized or achieved in Western countries either, but it is seen as they're seen as closer to the ideal, essentially. Whereas for former colonies, in a lot of cases, they're always seen as being on this path of progress towards sovereignty itself, but never fully realizing it or achieving it themselves. And because the norms, the values, the model of sovereignty as well keeps changing and keeps evolving, there is a sort of a situation in which those former colonies and other societies seem to be always lagging behind in a way, and always being late on this path of progress that sovereignty helps us to kind of define, and that is very problematic, obviously. So I guess the debate is whether, you know, non-Western states can really fully achieve sovereignty, or whether they will always be, you know, lagging behind in a lot of ways and always be on their path to maybe one day becoming sovereign, but never really fully being sovereign. So sovereignty being used as this sort of moving target almost, that can only be achieved, or, you know, that can only be that only Western actors or Western states can come really close to it, in a sense. So that's kind of what I was sort of referring to, I think there. But yeah, I don't know if Ayşe has something to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I agree with the caveat that I mean, there are non-Western states that are very, very sovereign in some ways. I mean, so it's a spectrum. So and that probably has to do with historical dynamics of state building and so on. So I agree with that little caveat that yeah, it's not, everybody is not in the same structural position when it comes to how they relate to the international order. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. We actually have another question in the chat box. I think we have some time left, so if it's okay with you, we can take it and then wrap it up, if that's okay. So we have one of our colleagues, Ruti Bala, asking, how do you relate sovereignty and citizenship? In recent scholarship on citizenship, there's a shift away from understanding citizenship as grounded in nation state towards positioning of citizenships as act practices. This one doesn't need to be legally recognized as a citizen in order to practice citizenships. So the citizenship doesn't seem to need sovereignty. In what way do you see sovereignty as tied to citizenship? Ayşe, can I ask you to reflect first, and Javier as a final statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I'm not familiar with this literature. I'm suspicious of the claim that citizenship right now doesn't need state sovereignty. I can imagine a different type of order where it doesn't, but I think a lot of the dynamics that we study and observe now are structurally produced. So it's very difficult to escape them just because you have, you know, the normative vision to do so. Just as, you know, it's difficult to escape capitalism, you know, just because you have critiques. So yeah, I mean, I think it is possible to develop another world with a different understanding of citizenship. And then that would imply a different understanding of sovereignty, maybe not the sovereignty that we understand and use as a, you know, the type of state sovereignty that we're discussing here. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. It has a lot of potential, I think, to focus on acts and practices that doesn't fall into that essentializing trap. Maybe it's an interesting question. Javier, sorry I interrupted you, but please go ahead with some final thoughts. Bring it home.
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with that literature either, so I guess I can only very kind of obliquely answer that question, really, in a lot of ways. But I think it's interesting. I agree with Ayşe that I don't think I do think that it's tied to sovereignty at the moment. But what seems to be interesting to me with citizenship is that to be a citizen, you also need to define who is not a citizen as well. And that is very much tied to a discourse of sovereignty, which is about excluding others as well, which is about saying who we are and who we are not, and who is outside of that sovereign sphere. And so I'm just thinking about my own sort of research, because I don't want to generalize too much. I've done that a lot already, but I don't want to generalize too much. In my own research, clearly the idea of the citizen, the city, is linked to civilization as well, and how we define sovereignty around civilization. And so, you know, having proper cities where you have proper citizens living in them is very much tied to the existence of a sovereign state. You know, non-sovereign states don't have proper cities, and therefore they don't have proper citizens either. So I guess that's kind of the way I can link that question to my research and to how this was kind of conceptualized in the 16th century in France, at least.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations and your reflections on the questions from the audience, from your research. I really learned a lot, and I have I made a lot of notes, and I have a lot of things that I would like to sit on and think further, and you really inspired me to do so. So I'm very grateful and happy that you could be here with us today. I really want to thank you for your contributions. And also a special thanks for Beste, who jumped in to save the Q&A on my behalf. So thank you so much, Beste, for doing so. And thank you for the audience for your engaging questions and for your participation in this webinar. We have some interesting new webinars coming up. The first of them is on the 17th of November, which is a book interview with Nadine Al-Inani, moderated by our colleague, Dr. Polly Pallister-Wilkins. And I'm really looking forward to that session as well, in which she will talk about her new book, Bordering Britain. So if you're interested, please register through the Ayse's website. So just to sum up, it was a great event. I'm really happy that you could be here with us today, and I'm looking forward to hopefully see you at one of our next events. I'm wishing you a wonderful evening.